Good evening. I'm Ron Kettleson. I'm president of the Sharon Historical Society. We'd like to welcome you to our program tonight. Fred Breglia is with us tonight. He's from Landis Arboretum, and he's got some great information that he's going to share with us tonight about big trees and forests in New York.
I think we're good, right?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for having me here tonight. And thanks to Ron for hosting this meeting. I'm going to talk to you tonight about big trees and ancient forests of New York. I'm Fred Breglia. I'm the director for the Landis Arboretum, and I've been there at the Arboretum for about 25 years. I'm also an ISA certified arborist, and I'm a member of the American Forest Big Tree Cadre, which basically is just a group of trained tree measurers, and we go out and measure a lot of the national champions, or confirm the measurements for a lot of folks on the national champions. I'm going to ask everybody to hold the questions to the end of this presentation. We may address them and cover your questions as we're moving through, but if not, I'll leave another 10 minutes or so at the end of the presentation for questions directly to me. And if for some reason we're out of time, we have that many questions, or you think of some questions at the end after this is over, you can always get me at Landis Arboretum on my website, or in my email, fred@landisarboretum.org. So without further ado, we're going to start into this presentation. There we go. Real quick plug for Landis Arboretum. The Arboretum means a lot to a lot of people. We have hundreds of acres, miles of hiking trails, native plant collection that encompasses most of the woody plants that you could grow in our hardiness zone of New York. And these are all labeled plants, and we've been adding a lot of infrastructure improvements and trail improvements. We have a nationally recognized oak collection. We're a really great place for birding, a lot of birds year round. Great for bluebirds. In particular, we've got a lot of boxes out. We've been a box site, nest site for bluebirds for a long time. Our year-round calendar events, we're working on it right now. It should be up online, literally, and if it's not already, it'll be on the next couple of weeks. We're finalizing a lot of the classes for this year. Some folks know us as the place with the annual plant sales. This year's spring plant sale will be the weekend after Mother's Day. So great place, great time to visit the Arboretum, great place to get a lot of great plants. We're a great wedding destination. We have live music, and we're located pretty conveniently from the capital region, about a half an hour outside of Albany Airport. So not too far. We like to say we're close to everything, but in the middle of nowhere. And that kind of works out, I think, for everyone that comes to visit as well. It's really remote there. You wouldn't think you'd be able to get to Albany Airport in 30 minutes. It always seems like a big distance drive, but it's not very far. You can also like us on Facebook for the Facebook users out there at Landis Arb. And that's a great way to stay current on day-to-day things, what's in bloom, and other little updates, including classes that we're going to be having. So when we get started, before we get into this, what is we talk about big trees. What is a tree? What are we actually talking about here? And what we are actually talking about, by definition, is a woody plant that has one perennial stem. Means it doesn't die back to the ground each year. And we'd like to see that at least 4.5 inches, or 3 inches or 4 inches at about 4.5 inches from ground level. And we'd like to get a mature height on it of at least 13 feet. So that's kind of general loose definition, but that's what we're comparing. And just to clarify, which I'll get into a little bit more in a minute, is having one perennial stem, which basically means having one pith or one center line. If you look at a cross section of a tree, which we're going to look at here right now, and you look at that center of that tree, that's what we call the pith. And each concentric ring gets bigger and bigger from the years. But if you were to cut that off, that tree, right at ground level, then you should see, if it is one tree, you should see one pith line or little circle in the center. If it's more than one tree at ground level, you would see 2 or 3 piths, hence 2 or 3 trees. I bring that up because you'll see very quickly why that becomes an issue. So it's the largest, so a champion tree is the largest known tree of a particular species. So we're looking for the largest we can find for a particular species. And it doesn't mean it's the largest in the world. And it doesn't even mean it's the largest in New York. What it means is it's the largest documented in New York, found. And we always like to think that there's bigger ones out there. And a lot of the big ones that are the champions also don't last as the champions forever. So when a big one falls, it opens up the door for another new champion. And to nominate a national champion or a state champion or a county champion, these are all based on a national standard by American Forest. And this has been the same formula that has been derived back in 1940 as we use today. It's the same exact formula with these measurements. Which you can see here. One is the trunk circumference, the height of the tree, and the crown spread. By measuring these three different sections, we could come up with a point total, and then you could compare various trees with each other. So a tall tree versus a fat tree versus a real wide tree, all can be compared via these measurements, and they come up with point totals. So as a calculation, trunk circumference inches, height in feet, and a quarter of the average crown equals total points. And we use those total points to figure out if it's the biggest tree or not. I will also say that any tree that would fall within 5 points of each other, they become co-champion. Now, I won't spend a ton of time with all the technicalities of this, but I am going to highlight some of the ways that we measure trees. But for anybody that would like some extremely in-depth information or a lot more information about how we measure trees in different circumstances, there's a free download here that's from AmericanForest.org. And the guy that wrote the book on measuring trees is this guy, Bob Leverett. He was recently featured in Smithsonian Magazine. Some of you may have seen that. He's been a good friend of mine for a really long time. I've been measuring trees and working with trees for probably over 25 years. Big trees, that is. Bob Leverett I met him, I think, year 1 or 2, and we worked together. He's been at Landis Arboretum multiple times. That book used to be about 4 or 5 pages prior to Bob Leverett revising it. And by the time he got done revising it, I think it's up to 84 pages now. So that's all available free from AmericanForest.org. But the gist of it is, let's start with the circumference. We're really wrapping a measuring tape, circumference tape. We don't measure them in dBH, diameter. We measure them in circumference. And they're measured at 4.5 feet up from the ground, sort of a standard. And you basically wrap a tape, and it should be perpendicular to the axis. If you're looking at this number 2 example here, it's perpendicular to the lean. So if it has a lean, you're wrapping it that way. If it's more or less straight, it's pretty much perpendicular that way. And you record the results in inches. And the circumference probably counts more to the point total than any other measurement. So here's a few different examples of how that can get used. Tree furthest on the left, number 1, clear, straight example. 2, is it got a lean, so you wrap perpendicular to the lean. 3 and 5 fall into a different category. 3 and 5 end up being either a fusion of trees. So number 3 could be 3 individual trees, or number 5, the actual, even if it's one tree, the fork is below 4.5 feet. And anytime you see that, we measure the single biggest stem. So for the examples of 5 and 3, we would measure the largest diameter stem. The other ones are straightforward measurements, trunk circumference. Simple as this woman's showing here, just wrapping a tape around a tree at 4.5 feet and keeping that tape level. So then we get into the pith that we had mentioned originally, one tree versus multiple trees debate. Here we go. How can we tell? Well, we mentioned that we just basically do this pith test, which follow the piths or central stalk of each of the boles or each of the main trunks down, and then they intersect above ground level. It's one tree. If if not, and you get at ground level with 2 or 3 different piths, then you've got 2 or 3 different trees. I'm going to outline that right now. This might make more sense visually. So photograph of an oak tree. Everyone agrees there. How many trees are we looking at? You don't have to answer that, but answer it in your head. If you answered 2 trees there, you'd be correct. So you can see that yellow line, it sort of illustrates the center point of that tree, or 2 trees. So at ground level, you would see 2 piths, and hence you've got 2 trees. So in a case like this, we would measure the larger single stem. We don't want to measure the main stem and then make 2 trees count in the place of 1 tree. And that's been the case with some national champions at the national level. there's been a number of these where they have been fusions, and we've gone back and actually, unfortunately, had to disqualify a number of great trees. They're still awesome trees, but they actually were more than one tree. So here we have an example of a big tree. And of course, you look at all the branches and all the pith lines, and they intersect above ground. And hence, this is indeed one tree. So 4.5 feet up, measured the circumference, away you go. Again, this will be one for you guys here. We'll test you a little bit. How many trees do you think we're looking at here at this California live oak? And if you answered 2 trees, you'd be correct. That's 2 individual trees. That's still a champion, ironically, because the one big stem that's there is still large enough to be the state champion of California. So it still ends up being a champion, but that is indeed 2 trees. How many trees do you think this peach leaf willow is? Is it 1, 2? If you answered 5, then you are correct. It's actually 5 different trees. And this was actually a national champion that has been disqualified. So this is a perfect example of one that's come off the record books. But we are looking for the biggest individual trunk trees, not a fusion of 5. Still a really cool tree, though, no doubt. Here we have a bald cypress in Louisiana. The national champion. Is it 1 or 2 trees? And that's 2. So I think we're getting the point here. The next measurement's pretty straightforward. It's the crown spread. So the spread the crown makes from its widest point and narrowest point. And then we do an average of the narrowest and the widest. And we take 0.25 or 1/4 of the average crown spread. And that gives us another point total for that, another criteria for that point total formula. Now, you'd think that would be pretty easy, but unfortunately, most crowns are not just uniform. So there's some measurements that need to get taken to get these crown spreads, but generally, crown spread is, I like to think, the easier measurement to get. And it also is the one that counts the least. So if there was an error, it would have the least significance in the total point volume. But how those are calculated in that book, they've come up with, like I said, virtually a formula for virtually every possible scenario in that book. Bob Leverett, that wrote the book, is not only a tree scientist, he's also a mathematician. So this guy probably gets almost equal amount of pleasure as measuring trees from a mathematical formula as he does actually getting out in the field. And there's a shot of another tool we use. This one's called a laser rangefinder. So some of the tools we use, most important is probably that laser rangefinder. Some of the rangefinders just shoot distances, and you've got to use them in conjunction with other tools to measure angles and calculators to do the math. Some of them actually do the mathematics for you, depending on the laser. I started using a simple laser. Actually, I started using just a regular tape. Then I used a laser. I've been using a clinometer here, which is on the left. That measures angles. I've been using that for a long, long time, and a scientific calculator and some trigonometry. We can come up with some pretty accurate numbers. But my newest tool looks a lot like this one here that Bob is using. And that's a true pulse laser. It's about $1,000 tool, but really worth it. It measures really, really accurately down to sometimes within an inch of accuracy at 100 feet. So pretty accurate tool. But these other tools are almost equally as accurate. It just really comes down to there's more mathematical errors with these tools and less mathematical errors with the true pulse laser. And then the circumference tape in inches is a really easy one, straightforward, and you just record what you're measuring. So height, it becomes the biggest sort of challenge a lot of times when we look at measurements, not from our standpoint, but from the public standpoint or from forester standpoint. Most people measure height using what we call a tangent method. And I won't get into any of the mathematics on this, but what I want to say is it's basically just the vertical separation between 2 horizontal planes. It's not the example like you see here with the leaning tree. The leaning tree is not really gaining anything by leaning, and actually it's losing a bit of height from actually leaning. So it's not the length of the actual trunk, it's the actual vertical separation between 2 horizontal planes. And that works quite well with the tangent method that most foresters use if the top of that tree is exactly over the bottom or the trunk of that tree, like a telephone pole. for example. Or this case with this third tree from the left here. That one also is pretty close. But anytime other than that, that tangent method creates major inaccuracies, and it's almost always showing taller trees than they actually are. So we use a different method called the sign method, and with that, you're going to be able to get the vertical separation between two horizontal planes, even if the top of the tree is not directly underneath the bottom of the tree. And how often do we actually see the top directly over the bottom? I mean, maybe once over the past 20 years. You know, it doesn't happen too often. But the height is not the trunk length. Now, here we have a tree crown, and we're looking up into that. That red arrow is actually showing the top of the tree. And you might think, what the heck? This one looks way taller. And it certainly looks taller from your perspective on the ground. But that's so great about that true pulse laser is that it lets you take a lot of measurements and replicate them pretty quickly, very accurately. So on a tree like this, I'll actually take measurement, bouncing them off almost all those top leads on that crown. And it'll tell me which one is actually the true top by doing that. You'll get a higher measurement, higher measurement. You keep hitting every top from different angles, and you keep going till you get the highest measurement you can get. And in this case, this is actually the true top. In other words, if you were to look at this thing and you could really see it, this would be the tallest part of the plant. And why that becomes a problem is it's an illusion. You're down here looking up. You might be looking at this part of the crown. You might never actually even be able to see the true top unless you get far enough back to be able to see it. And if you can see it, which in most cases you can, it may appear lower, like this, for example. So, you know, here we have this picked up as the true top where the arrow is. And really it's reading, because of that, it's actually giving us a false measurement. So we do have to be careful with where we choose that top lead. But again, these new tools, these sophisticated technical equipment helps us really accurately measure that. Now, this is not as important if you're a forester. For any foresters out there, they're probably like, why do you need to get this technical? Well, again, we don't need to for forestry. And the tangent method that most foresters have used or still use today still works really good for them. But we're trying to see if it's the biggest in the state or the biggest in the nation. And sometimes it comes down to a foot or two. So, so you can see why we need to get really accurate with our measurements. So that being said, let's take a look at some big trees. The Big Tree Registry is put out by American Forests, and it was started by Fred Breglia. He was a forester, and he made an official measurement of the tree, the Y oak, which became the biggest oak in the nation until it eventually failed. And it was featured in a magazine in 1919. I got a copy of that here on the left under Fred's picture. And in 1940, it became the official largest white oak tree in the nation, Quercus alba. And it stood on that as the record oak tree all the way till its demise in 2002. So it's the longest running champion tree in the history of the tree project. And white oaks have always been a very coveted, sort of top contender in the tree world, especially for the Northeast. But white oak has a wide distribution range, so it stretches all the way down into the South. And the biggest white oaks actually are usually found in Maryland, Virginia. The current national champion is in Virginia, but we have them really here heavy in New York State. And like I said, the white oak is probably one of the most sought after trees. It's also our national tree. So, again, gets a lot of publicity. But by all means, you could look at the title of every tree on there and how big they get on that registry. Here we have a shot of the Y oak back in 1925. Here we have a shot of the Y oak in 1936. Here's another shot of the Y oak in 1965. Here's another shot of the Y oak that was taken in 1971. The shot of the Y oak taken in 1979. You can see the car there. That was not too recently. And here's a shot of the Y oak in 2002 after a big storm took it out, and it failed. And when these big trees fail, again, it opens up the door to other champions. But this one here was replanted with a clone. So this is actually a baby Y oak. It was actually propagated from the original original Y oak. So it's a genetic clone of the Y oak, and it's planted, as you can see, right in the right in sort of the stump area where the big guy fell or failed. And then in 2009, they took an original cross section or chunk of that main trunk, and they put it and created the park, the Y Oak Park now in Maryland. So you can go there and certainly see a big piece of the trunk. It's still preserved for posterity, for people to remember this giant tree, which started the big tree movement in a way. And it's not that much similar, not that much different, I should say, from what happened to the one at Landis Arboretum. This is a white oak, same species as the Y oak. That's at was at Landis Arboretum. It was a 400-year-old white oak. It was one of the oldest in New York State. And unfortunately, it also failed. This one failed to Hurricane Irene, which took it out. It broke out the main part of this trunk, and all of its branches went with it. And now you can see on the right here, that's sort of our memorial to our great oak. And we left the main bowl there for folks to see the size of it, and wildlife use it too. And then on the lower left here, you can see a baby white oak was planted in the root system of this big giant. So it's a living memorial to the big boy as well. And this continues on. This is a trend you'll see. Champions are crowned and champions fall, literally. Here we have a New York State champion American elm tree. And this shot is not recent. This one, as you can tell, this one was taken in 1953. But this state champion tree was actually in Sloansville. It was growing in a field in Sloansville. And unfortunately, it was taken down because it died of Dutch elm disease, which wiped out most of the large elms, unfortunately. And it was cut down in 1953. It was obviously a giant spectacle. And they took a cross section of this tree, and they actually gave it to the old stone fort. So if you go to the old stone fort today, you'll actually see a cross section of this American elm that was our state champion at one point, up till obviously 1953. But this is not an old thing of trees failing. This is a new thing, and this is another gigantic oak, white oak as well, that we found this past year. It was one that we had actually seen in the past and went back to get some more official measurements. And when we got there, literally, you can see that the tree had failed. Obviously, this past fall, it looks like there's still remnants of leaves there and stuff. So it wasn't too long ago. But now that opens up the door for yet another big tree. And here we have an example for a potential New York State white oak. This one is down in Blenheim. It's at what they call the Royal Oak Farm. And it's a colossal plant. It's gigantic. It's going to be our probably future state champion white oak tree. And I say going to because the one that's currently in lead position is not very much bigger. It's actually really close, but it's an older tree and it's in decline. So every year that state champion is getting a little bit smaller, a little shorter. And this one's in the prime of its life. It's putting on amazing growth. In fact, I looked up some of the growth from when I first measured it to when I last measured it. And when I first measured this tree back in 2000, the year 2000, it was 17 feet 1 inch circumference. When I measured this past year, the tree is now over 19 and change circumference. So it added 2 feet in about 20 in less than 20 years, or about 20 years. So that being said, it's only a matter of time before another branch comes off the state champion, and I'm there to measure it. This one's going to be a state champion in the future, so keep your eye on this big boy. You can see it right from the road. It's visible just beyond the Blenheim Bridge that got washed out, also by Hurricane Irene, and they rebuilt it. Which, if anyone's not seen that bridge that's been rebuilt, it's incredible. We stop there every time we go out this way to remeasure these trees. I want to show you this one. This is another gigantic tree, not too far away from that other tree I just showed you. And not all big trees are old, and not all old trees are big. But this is an oak that has potential to be one of the oldest oaks in New York State. We've been sort of looking for the next oldest oak because the great oak at Landis Arboretum was what we most folks consider to be one of the oldest in the state. And we've been looking for another replacement since then. And I think we very well may have found one here. This is an incredibly old tree. It's huge, but it's growing on pretty much rock. It's not down in the rich valley soil. It's actually growing up on like a very shallow bedrock. And the fact that this tree is that big without a good water source or even good soil, it's just a testament to the age on it. And it's almost 20 foot around, and it lost, you can't see it on the backside. It lost probably a quarter of that tree has fallen and peeled away. And it's still 20 foot circumference with that piece missing. Now, it doesn't take the state champion because the top is really short on this tree. So it has a big trunk, but the other measurements are small. But that indicates that the tree is potentially really old. And here's a shot of that same tree in the summertime. This is when we first found it. And this other one's when we went back this past year. This is a very recent shot. Here's another gigantic oak, white oak, also in the Schoharie Valley. This one's in Middleburgh on private land. And spotted this guy literally from probably a mile away. It was up on a mountain, and I have got some secrets to sort of helping me find big trees. One of the tips I would say to folks, if you're looking for big trees, is that, most people think big tree, it has to be taller than everything else around it. So it's easy to see. How could this be so hard to find, guys? And the real reality of that is when you look at an old tree like this, they're actually not taller than the rest of the trees. They're often the same height or even shorter than the rest of the trees. But of course, they're bigger and they have big branches, and they usually have these long horizontal branches. And a good tip, including how I found this one, was I searched hillsides, I searched countrysides, I searched the old back roads during or right after a snowstorm. The kind of snowstorm that would actually let the snow stick to the branches, especially the horizontal branches. And when it does that, it creates a white line horizontally through the woods, and you can see the large branch now that you couldn't see the rest of the time without that snow being on it. And of course, this only works in the winter. So I actually find more big trees during the dormant season when the leaves are off than when they're on. And I can't tell you how many big trees I've spotted with that horizontal branch with snow on it. So, good tip to get out there and find them if you're looking for them. And we don't just pick on white oak trees to find either, even though that's sort of the, one of my favorite trees. We also find big red oaks. This one here was in Ballston Spa, and it has potential to be just another whopper of a measurement tree. And I say has the potential because we actually didn't measure this one yet. We got to go back. I saw it from the road, and when I saw it, I just literally, left the car, jumped out of the car while it was rolling, pretty much. And we poached this one. We knocked at the door of the house, and of course nobody was home that day, so no one answered. I'm like, we grabbed a quick photo and went and left. But we are coming back to measure this guy. And this is a red oak, Quercus rubra. And again, other oaks are on the list as well. This is a state champion chestnut oak. This one's down in the Power Authority down in Blenheim. And there's some phenomenal trees down at the Power Authority. They got some really good oaks down there as well. And this was state champion chestnut oak. And this is a state champion, I should say was state champion. It's already been dethroned, but that was a state champion for about a year, the pin oak, champion pin oak for New York State. And this one's out in the Albany area. Another whopper. This is not a oak at all. This one here is a bald cypress. And this is the current state champion bald cypress. It's been the current state champion bald cypress since 1953. And if you go see this tree, this one's also on public land, so you can visit it. If you know where Bleecker Stadium is in Albany, it's at Bleecker Stadium. Bleecker Stadium is not overly large, so if you do a couple of laps around Bleecker Stadium driving, you're going to see this tree. Incredible bald cypress. And this is the exact same trees that grow in the swamps in Florida, in Louisiana. And you see the big knees, or these like buttressed knees coming up all around the root system out of the water. And the reason for that is the tree actually uses those knees to actually transmit air exchange. So it's using that in flooded conditions. But yet you look at this tree, and it's a perfect example. There are absolutely no knees or those buttresses that are coming up around it. And that's because it's a really dry site. The tree doesn't need those structures to sort of help with air exchange. it's dry. It doesn't have to worry about water. So bald cypresses, and I can't say enough good things about them. They're certainly one of my favorite deciduous conifers, and they're very old. They'll get ages of 1,000 years old. They'll grow from Florida in standing water all the way to Maine, and they'll work in standing water, like I mentioned, but they'll also work in really dry sites, like you see here. It actually makes for a really good street tree. So bald cypress, just really cool. But this is our New York State champion, and it's a real whopper to see one this big, this far north. Another behemoth of a tree here. This is the state champion silver linden in New York, and this one's in Washington Park, so you can also go there and see this tree. Just a really cool old tree. And silver lindens, if you don't know the plant, when they are in bloom, they put out a really sweet smell. So when you go see this tree, if it's in bloom, you will actually hear the bees buzzing and see the pollinator cloud before you even get to the tree. It's, I mean, just a magnet for insects. The sweet smell of that linden flower is hard to resist for pollinators, but just a beast at any time of year. We found this brought to us by another individual. This is potentially going to be a state champion sugar maple. This one's down in western part of New York State. It's not too far from Oneida Lake, if you know that area. Here we have another tree that we just measured. This is actually right off the press, literally, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago. And this is a horse chestnut tree that right now is looking like our new state champion horse chestnut as well. Another behemoth of a sugar maple in western New York as well. This one's along the Fishkill Creek. And I don't know if it's still standing. It was really rickety when we visited it. I mean, tons of wood and tons of weight held by like fragmented inches of good wood left. So if this tree is still standing, it would be amazing. We thought it was a potential state champion, but it missed the mark by, I think, about 10 or 15 points. So really, really close. This one is a state champion. This is a state champion catalpa, hardy catalpa. And this is also in that western part of New York. It's all of those trees we just showed you are all not too far from Oneida Lake, in that general area, Fishkill Creek, and the like. This is another beast of a tree, state champion honey locust for a lot of years, and located right in downtown Middleburgh at an historic house. You could see this from if you know where Stewart's is in Middleburgh, and you drive that street. It's if I was coming from entering Middleburgh sort of from the creek there at the bridge, and driving towards the Stewart's. My Stewart's is now on the right. It used to be on the left. And the tree is on the left past the Stewart's. And I say was the state champion for a really long time, because another big one was found, even larger. And it's an even older tree, and even a gnarlier tree. So again, this is not always the biggest there is, it's the biggest found. And, you know, this one, like I said, was a champ for many, many, many years. And it's still certainly it's number 2 in New York State right now. I've never seen a honey locust this big in New York, except for that other one that we have as well. So just a real beast. And if you look in the middle of the tree here, you can see an old, maybe an old pruning wound, and there's a bunch of big thorns on there. I don't know if you guys can notice it, but honey locusts have, thorns. They're probably 2 inches long. Amazing plant, and really hard wood. So all these big trees, of course, have led us to into a lot of publicity. Biggest new state champion, new national champion. So we got a lot of press out of this. We got on the Wall Street Journal a few years ago. We were featured as on a cover of sections of the Daily Gazette multiple times. CBS 6 News picked us up, and we've got been on the news more than once measuring big trees. The little guy on the right here is my son Freddie Jr., and he's learning the ropes as well. And we also formed a couple of different groups on Facebook, Big Tree Seekers and Ancient Forests, both on Facebook, public groups. Join them if you're not already a member. And if you want to see more big trees. But these groups were started originally because we wanted to actually communicate with other big tree seekers around the world, around the country. So I linked up about 6 or 8 of us that started the group. After a short amount of time, we got internationally known. Big tree seekers from all different parts of the world joined the group. The group grew at an alarming rate, so much so that Facebook noticed it and asked us to be, if we were interested in being a part of a sort of a publicity campaign to highlight the group as a featured group for Facebook. And of course, we are all about getting the word out about big trees and the need to protect them. So we agreed to that whole thing, and that turned into another tree hunt, only this time in California. And the big tree that we found there actually ended up on a billboard in New York City. So we like to say a tree goes in Manhattan. In this case, we had a billboard that wrapped 4 city blocks that actually went around the 2 other sides of that building, if you can believe that. And this was all done. You can see here, this is the tree that we found in California. This is actually me right here on the billboard. And this is me taking a shot of me on the billboard and actually at downtown Manhattan. And it was great. It stood up for about 3 weeks to a month in that location. And it was also held, put into place during the UN climate meetings, and also the national rally of students, the student environmental rally that also happened in New York City. So good timing and a lot of publicity for Schoharie County and the world and their big trees. So talked a lot about these big trees. So I'm going to leave that for a bit and just start talking a little bit about ancient forests here. So ancient forests, and I mentioned this before, I sort of started saying it and I sort of bit my tongue because I know I'm going to say it again now. Basically, all old trees are not big, and not all big trees are old. That being said, we're going to look at some examples of both. But originally, we had all this green forest cover was what we had as original forest. And then as of 2016, it was down to a very small amount of that. Now, we're not saying that the forests are gone here. We're saying original forests are gone. So, don't mistake me for thinking that all the forest, all the green's gone. But all that forest was cut. And original forest right now is statistically, we're about 0.25% left in the world, 0.25% left. In the United States, we got a little bit better percentage than that. We got about 4% left of old growth in the Northwest, less in other parts of the country. New York State has the second most large old growth of any state on the East. North Carolina has number 1, but you can see why we want to protect that last 2 or 3% or 0.25%, or even if you got a lot of it, you got 4% out in the Northwest. We really want to start to look at some of those secondary forests and secondary growth forests and letting some of those not get cut so we can actually start to grow more old growth. You leave it long enough, it turns into old growth, about 150, 200 years. So what is old growth? Well, we're going to get to that in just a second. But I do want to point out that in New York State, most of the old growth, largest stretches or contiguous forests of old growth end up being in the Adirondacks. But there's pockets of old growth all over the New York State, including Landis Arboretum. And I also worked with Governor Patterson, and back in 2008, Bruce Kirschner, who's on the left here, a good friend of mine, and I helped to co-write the first ever New York State law to protect old growth forests. It's called the Bruce S. Kirschner Heritage Tree Preservation and Protection Act. And it was named after Bruce. He had passed away while we were helping to write this bill. And Governor Patterson did sign it into a law. And I've got the pen certificate in my office with the actual pen that he used to sign it. So hang it up at Landis Arboretum. But good. I always say, think global, act local. And this is a great example of how, we sort of help to do that. So what is old growth? Well, here's another one. We sort of looked at what a big tree is and what could possibly be controversial about what old growth is. Well, that topic is actually a pretty heated topic. Some people consider old growth only certain amounts of ages. Some people say if there's any disturbance whatsoever, that it can't be old growth. But we know that natural disturbances come in forests, including massive windstorms and forest fires. And those forests are reset to sometimes ground zero. And then those forests have actually grown back to old growth if you take a lot of the people out of the equation and just how that process happened. So most scientists can agree that at least an old growth forest is a forest that has attained a great age without significant disturbance. And the most important thing is that it exhibits unique ecological features that are unique to old growth forests. And we're going to look at some of those features here in the next handful of slides. So what are those characteristics? Well, big trees, we've talked a lot about that. So big trees are certainly part of an old growth forest. And here we have some really big ones. These are were some of the tallest in New York State up till recently, white pines. And this is in Adirondacks, in not too far from Paul Smith's College of Forestry. And the guy on the left here is Dr. Michael Kudish. He took us in there, multiple trips with him, learned a lot of stuff about the evolution of old growth in the Adirondacks. He also is an expert on the Catskills. And up till recently, that was our state champion's white pine. Tallest one, in fact, the tallest tree in New York State, 158 feet. But that's been dethroned recently. They found a bigger tree, taller tree. So now our new New York State's tallest tree is a white pine at 164.7. And that was measured less than a year ago. So you pretty much take that measurement, to the bank. This was officially measured by, cadre members who spent an ungodly amount of time working up the potential for an error in the calculation. But at the end of the day, it ended up being 164.7, the new tallest tree for New York State. And that one is in Ampersand Mountain, also in the Adirondacks, just dominant white pine up in the Adirondacks there. Some other potential contenders, should that tree fall, is cathedral pines of Seventh Lake. We've measured a few trees in there that are a little bit bigger than 150. The pine orchards in Wells, New York, there's a few trees in there that have rated that 149 range, 150 foot range. Some trees in there are close to 4 foot diameter or even a little bit bigger. The oldest white pine in the state is not the biggest. So again, old trees, big trees, not always one of the same. The oldest in New York State, you're looking at it right here in a slide with this gentleman. And it's 470 years ago, 470 years old. Those big ones that I had showed you were probably only about 250 to 300 years old. So when I say only, but this one's 470, and this one's in out in Nelson Swamp. It's owned by the Nature Conservancy. And I know SUNY ESF out there spends a lot of time in that forest, but it's smaller, stunted white pine, a solid 150 years older than any of the other ones we've measured. Really old tree. And that forest, Nelson Swamp, also is home to a couple of different rare plants, including the spreading globeflower that's in the photo here. And when I say they're endangered, I mean really endangered. Their only place in the world where these are found are actually in this forest at Nelson Swamp. Hence, the Nature Conservancy is concerned to preserve it. But that's not something that's rare to old growth forests. You actually find the largest proportions of endangered animals and plants in old growth forest ecosystems. So, and we're talking about that last, anywhere from 0.25% to 4%, depending on what state or country you're in. But small trees, we talk about big trees. Small trees are often some of the oldest trees. Which is, it's hard to believe, but a lot of these trees, these small ones, just gear themselves up for growth, and they're often in very stressed sites. So they sort of, instead of just growing carefree, they become resource misers. They use their little bit of water or nutrition that they can get, and they use it very conservatively. And they gear themselves, instead of trying to be as big as they can in these stress sites, they gear themselves to grow a little slower, take their time. Hence, utilizing those rare amounts of water and nutrition a little bit more effectively. So here we have one. This one's in Schoharie County. It's opposite side of the valley from Vroman's Nose, and really close to that really big state champion, former state champion honey locust. So if you go there, you can see the honey locust, and you can also hike up here. And there's about maybe a mile hike up on the, and it's publicly accessible. on the Northville Placid, or not Northville Placid, the long path. I'm sorry, the long path that goes through New York State, including parts of Schoharie County. It's the little aqua blazes that you'll see from time to time, and the path goes right up to these old trees. And then we have little trees that are 15 years old or 15 feet tall that are 500 years old. To give you a better idea where these trees are located, there's Roman's Nose on the lower left, on the left-hand side, and the X is kind of where we were looking at on those cliffs. Amazingly old trees. This was actually, it ended up being a great success story, another great one for Schoharie County. The trees that we found here were of interest to the Earth Observatory, part of Columbia University, and they sent a crew there to collect data. And they actually recreated 1,000-year weather chronology from this site that shows times of drought, times of feast, times of famine for the trees. And that means water or really dry water and things like that. And it was also written up in Science Magazine as well. You can see me here in the hard hat, and my partner in crime for this mission, Neil Peterson, Dr. Neil Peterson. He now teaches at Harvard Forest, part of Harvard University. And this was just one cross section. This one's in my office. You can see the rings on there, really tight rings. This one I think has about 400 rings on there, but we have some that are even older than that as well. Just really slow growth. And of course, we did not cut a tree to obtain this sample. This was obtained from a dead section that was laying on the ground, cross section of a dead. Usually there's so much dead material in an old growth forest that you don't really need to do too much to find a piece of dead that you can cut through. You don't need to take anything off lives, but occasionally we do some increment boring to get dates or ages of live trees, and I will talk about that in just a minute. But this sort of theme of hard to reach places and really harsh sites just is not, like I said, unique to the Schoharie Escarpment or Schoharie County. It's unique to the, it's kind of a world trend and certainly a national trend. Here we have New York State's oldest pitch pines. These are 360 years old in the Shawangunk Mountains, part of Minnewaska State Park. And guess where they're growing? Harsh site. Slow growth, small trees, old trees. And even the world's oldest tree, which is a bristlecone pine in California, over 5,000 years old. This tree germinated in like 3000 BC. So, at the year 0, this tree was already pretty old. And it's over 5,000 years old. In fact, I think it's actually close to 5,200 years old. And another harsh site, dry, high elevation, cold winters, severe wind. New York State's oldest black gum trees are located right here in Greenfield Center, Saratoga. There are trees there that are over 500 years old. In fact, I think there might be some new ones that they found that the dates actually are close to 600 years old on these trees. So really old. And again, these are not huge trees either. They're at the northern end of their range. Black gum likes it warmer, likes it in the south. And although it is native here, and of course, these were not planted, it's at the northern end of their range. So the trees are more stunted, and because of that sort of stunted condition, they ended up getting older. It's really hard to get in there except for wintertime when you can access it. It's a swampy area, and the tops are all busted out. Green Lake State Park over here in Syracuse area also has some incredible old growth, really publicly accessible. I've been trying to showcase a lot of the places that are open to the public as opposed to some private places we know as well. But Green Lake's just an incredible state park. Easy hiking, old growth forest galore, big trees, big tree old growth, the kind of stuff that really ooh and ah you. And really cool lakes. They're some of the deepest lakes in New York State as well. And I believe they're what they call meromectic lakes, which don't actually turn over. They're so deep that the bottom part of that water never gets to the top, and the top never gets to the bottom. Really green. And I mentioned sometimes we actually have to take measurements of live trees, and we use increment borers to do that. These are nothing more than just kind of like a maple syrup type hole when you do sap production. We're drilling in, we're taking a plug out. This is what it looks like. And you can see each of those rings already. We pull that plug out and we put them in CSDs. CSDs stand for core storage devices. They're really nothing more than just drinking straws, but it makes us sound way more technical if we use an acronym like CSD. In any case, all jokes aside, drinking straws work well. They do sell these for lab work as well. But I will say that the Arby's drinking straws are probably the best ones. They fit the core in really nicely with a little extra room. The other ones tend to get a little bit tight. And I bring them back to the lab, which is my office, and I mount them down to CMBs, core mounting bases. Again, pretty non-technical, really. It's just a piece of wood with a routed out groove. And I glue down with wood glue the cores. And the reason for that is if you handle these cores without gluing them down to a CMB, you're going to break all apart. You can't sand them, and you have to sand them to really read the lines. So you try to sand these without mounting them down, they break apart, doesn't work. So you glue them down, and then you use sandpaper, of course, first, and then really fine sandpaper, emery cloth at the end, and the rings pop right out. And then you can sit there and you can just, with a needle, I use a needle, sit there and count them. They used to call me the Lord of the Rings, but now they call me the Tree Man. Anyways, most old growth forests typically are not all old big trees, or not all tiny trees. They're actually usually a range of ages and sizes. And these giant tulip trees are actually in an old growth forest at New York Botanical Garden in New York City. And they're not the only arboretum in New York with old growth. Landis Arboretum certainly has some significant old growth as well. Here's a couple of oak trees that are in the woodlands, 200 plus year old red oak. Here's some more red oaks in our woodlands. You can see a mix of ages here, not just big ones. This is a American beech, huge American beech with Bruce Kirshner that the Law's named after, that he and I co-wrote. This is a picture of him at Landis Arboretum with a gigantic grapevine. Look at the size of that grapevine going up this beech. Unfortunately, that beech has now since fallen. That also fell to another giant storm. So that one split, and it took the grapevine with it. Again, opens up the door for another big one, and all of that becomes part of the healthy forest soil. So it's, you hate to lose a big one, but it's sort of part of it as well. And we were recently, the old growth at Landis Arboretum was recently recognized by the Old Growth Forest Network. We got a sign there now. We have interpretive signage. You can see this old growth with interpretive signage telling you what it is, what you're looking at, and just adds a real lot to the informal learning that someone can get from a visit to Landis Arboretum. This coarse woody debris, I mentioned there's a lot of woody debris. You can usually find some dead stuff to cut through. This is common with old growth forests. In fact, they say there's almost as much dead material on the forest floor as there is alive growing in the forest. This giant tree was fallen in Saratoga Spa State Park, and we got there a little too late. We had heard about this story of this giant swamp white oak that might be a new state champion, and we found that obviously it had fallen a few years at least before we got there. But we did measure the carcass that was there, and the measurements actually exceeded the current state champion. So it would have certainly been that. But all this dead material doesn't go to waste. It becomes nurse logs for the future forests. And you can see this old fallen section here, and you can see all the life that's coming out of that. Just a mecca for life. They actually are literally they're called nurse logs for a reason. They nurse the seedlings on till they can get big enough to become the new forest. And that kind of works like this. The seedling grows in a rotted log, and then the rotted log eventually sort of rots away from underneath the living tree. It often leaves these sort of stilted roots. Eventually those become buttresses, and you don't even notice that. I'll sort of wrap this up in a few minutes here, but I want to highlight a couple more forests. Palmagot Ravine in Minnewaska State Park, a lot of really big old trees there, a lot of really big hemlocks there. It's really hard to get in. There's no trails. In fact, this part of the park is closed to visitors unless without obtaining special permission, which we had to sort of age some of these hemlocks down there. And unfortunately, they're actually all dying to another invasive insect called the woolly adelgid. It's a small little not microscopic, but small little insect that sucks the life out of the foliage and ends up leaving a wake of destruction in its path. So unfortunately, most of these big hemlocks are probably not going to make it. But we went in there to document what we had. We also found the oldest red maple in New York State on one of those trips, a 338-year-old red maple here. And you look at the foliage, or the foliage, I should say the bark of that, it almost looks more like a shagbark hickory than it does maple, but it's everything, every bit maple. Red maples get shaggy when they get really, really old. Most people just don't see. Is one of the another magic places in New York State. Zoar Valley was it has we call it the tallest forest in New York. It has the second tallest tree in New York State located there. This gigantic tulip tree at 163.5. It also, so not only has the second tallest tree in New York, it also has the third tallest tree in New York as well in Zoar Valley. This one's 160.2 as of the last measurement. And not only does it have the second and third tallest tree in New York State, it also has the fourth tallest tree in New York State as well. The bitternut hickory at 157.5. It actually forms the largest, tallest canopy in a forest in New York State that's been documented. And all of this was actually scheduled to be chopped down. And it was a bunch of local activists that sort of took the initiative to start a rally, sort of a campaign to help save this forest. And then me and Bruce Kirshner and a few other people, including Bob Leverett, who was in Smithsonian Magazine this past issue on the oldest tree, if anyone's read that. Bruce Kirshner and I were all in this forest at the same time. And we were just basically collecting data so that that activist group would know whether it's, is it old growth? Do we have something here? And at the end of the day, of course, we did come out of there with a bunch of kink necks from looking up at these giant trees. And we gave all that data of, the amazing discoveries of heights and sizes to the group that took it to the capital of New York State, down in Albany, and did a huge protest, and ended up eventually getting that, with our help and the help of those folks. They were called Friends of Zoar Valley. We talked the state into not cutting this down. And now it's actually considered a natural heritage part of New York State, and it's a showcase. So it's a very great success story. It's about 100 acres or more of pristine old growth that would have been destroyed. Like I said, no trip to Zoar Valley is complete without a kink neck from looking up. Without further ado, I'm going to wrap this up. Before I do, I'll say, if you're not a member of Landis Arboretum, consider joining. It helps us grow. You don't need to be a member to come out to utilize the Arboretum, though. It's free of charge, whether you're a member or not, year round, 365 days a year, dawn to dusk. And I'm going to put my contact info here in case people need to get a hold of me. And then I'll turn it over to questions and answers for 5 or 10 minutes or so. If there's not that many, great. And you know where to get me. I can run, but I can't hide. Should you come up with some questions? And of course, if you keep your eye out for any more big trees and or some old growth, let me know if you think you found something. I can tell you, be happy to come out and look at visit. I'm always looking for an excuse to see another big tree. Thank you all for joining me. Questions and answers. I turn it over to Ron to take that part.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, type in the chat down at the bottom, or you can just unmute yourself and ask Fred the questions directly. But Fred, that was a great presentation. It was just very interesting, and really appreciate your sharing your knowledge with us. I learned a lot. And
great. I'm glad. As you can tell, I'm interested in this. I do this work. I can't stop doing it. So, I'm looking for an excuse to come out to your neck of the woods to find another big one.
Are there any other questions for Fred? Like I said,
it sounds like everyone's ready for my test now that we're going to be emailing you. No, just kidding.
How do you determine the pith for sure on multiple tree stems?
Well, that's the hardest question, the hardest one to find. Generally, there's enough evidence externally that we're able to tell that it's not a single tree. And by doing that, it's easier. We also have a panel of people that are all experts. So if a big tree has a fusion, we'll take photos of that fusion from all sides, and then we'll send it to the committee, and the group will sort of look at that, a bunch of experts, and sort of put their best guess as to whether it's a single tree or not. And the reason why I say that is because on some of these really big trees, that pith is not going to be so easy to get to or even find. On smaller trees, it's easier, but on the bigger trees, it's harder. So a lot of times on the really big trees that have heart rot, and they don't even have a central pith, it's more through committees or groups from the board of the cadre that can sort of make those judgment calls. Most of the time, I will say it's kind of obvious, like the ones that we saw in the photos. And if it's really a blurred, we have to give it the benefit of the doubt if we can't prove it otherwise. We do our best. Due diligence is what we try to do to make it fair for all the trees and the people that put them in.
So Carla Jean says it's great to know that there's still some horse chestnut and elm trees left. So you're finding more of those in the area?
Well, horse chestnuts are not to be confused with American chestnuts. So the American chestnuts, which are Castanea dentata, are not even in the same genus as horse chestnut, which is actually in Hippocastanum genus. So, and that's been a confusion for folks over the years because they hear chestnut. And what makes it even more confusing is that the actual nuts are dangerously, when you look at those American chestnuts to horse chestnuts, that it's dangerously close. And one's toxic, one's poison, one could actually kill you, and the other one is good for you. So you really have to know it. But the outside surface of that nut is completely different, and the leaves of the tree are completely different. So that's just addressing the horse chestnut. That being said, there's not too many big chestnuts that we find, American chestnuts, in the area. I do know where lots of sprouts are of American chestnuts, though, and I am going to actually be working on one old forest that has a whole bunch of giant trees, as well as a whole bunch of younger true American chestnut, as well as a whole bunch of sassafras all growing in it. And sassafras are also under threat right now. So that's not too common to see that around our area. The American chestnut is really rare to see. But horse chestnut, not bad. Now I'll address the elm trees because I believe she had also said elms. So elm trees are also everywhere, but big elm trees are not. The Dutch elm disease really only kills, I shouldn't say only, but the major impact is it takes out the mature elms. So, every street, including Cobleskill, got an elm street, and almost every town, every you go around the country, you'll see that. It's a great street tree, and you almost never find an elm tree growing on Elm Street anymore, unless it's like a hybrid elm where they put them in. So we don't find too many big American elms anymore either, but we do find American elms everywhere. There's tons of them, but to find them, much bigger around than that is less common.
Yeah. Well, that's great, Fred. We really appreciate your time today. And before we leave, there's just a couple of things that I wanted to share with the group. And let me see if I can get this to pull up. Our next program is not November 8th. I didn't change that. It's March 14th at 7 p.m. And that's presented by Dana Cudmore. It's all about caves, underground empires, 2 centuries of exploration, adventure, and enterprise in New York's cave country. So very interesting and we do have a lot of caves in our area, and we actually have 2 programs about caves this year because it's so interesting. Here's a list of our upcoming programs, and you can see we have quite a variety of programs, everything from the descendants of the 1692 Salem witch trials. That's a very interesting program. Well, a local program about if streets could talk. It's the history of Sharon Springs, all of the buildings that were here. General North, it's a very interesting program. The history of hops farming in Schoharie County. Ted Short's going to be doing that. The forgotten history of blacks in Schoharie County. Pete Lindemann's going to be doing that. The notorious RGB, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And then it's very interesting that one of our most popular programs was on quilting. And we did that last year, and we had over 14,000 people view that program after we replayed it. So the person that did that will be coming back, and she's doing a whole new program on historical quilts. And as you look through some of the others, we've got just a real variety of local interest, local history, stories, and then some that are more global. So another program, I watched this one, and the gentleman did it. It was on Anne Frank's Europe before and during and after her diary. That was a very interesting one. So you can reach us at the Sharon Historical Society. If you're going to email us, make sure you put that NY at the end, Sharon Historical Society NY at Gmail. And then we've just launched a brand new website, which is Sharon Historical Society NY.org. If you haven't looked at it, go to the website. There's a ton of information on there. We have all of our newsletters are on there. We have all kinds of research information. We have over 71 years of yearbooks from Sharon Springs. The high school yearbooks are on there. We're going to be listing all of our cemeteries. There's 75 cemeteries in the area. So a lot of great information. Again, it's Sharon Historical Society NY.org. So one more time, Fred, we want to thank you for your time tonight, and we look forward to having you, everyone here, join us for our next program. If you watch this program, you'll automatically get an email about the next one. So we'll look forward to our next program, which will be on March 14th. So have a good evening, everyone.
Take care. Thank you all. Be well, my friends.
Thank you.